rebel army was engaged in a war with the biggest empire around. And after some initial success, the Imperial Army had driven the rebel army back in a series of defeats. The rebels had retreated to a cold outpost, and the cold was turning against them. They were desperately short on food, hope, and ammunition. So the rebel leader decided to make a plan for a desperate and dangerous counterattack in hopes that a victory would halt the Imperial Army's advance. Now, the rebel leader, he wasn't a professional soldier, but he'd been in fights before. He was one of the best racers of his day, and despite the occasional outburst of anger and passion, was known for his calm and steady demeanor. He could regularly be found at the front, rallying his men, and many times he would find holes in his jacket from shots which had narrowly missed him. He knew that the situation was desperate, and he knew something had to be done. And so they made their plans to launch their attack, but from the beginning, things started not going very well. There was troubles loading the assault craft. They were desperately behind schedule. With every passing minute, the chances of failure increased. At one point, a key component of the rebel army became lost. But finally, they launched their attack, and quickly the battle turned into a victory for the rebels. And in succession, they won a series of battles, halting the Imperial Army's advance and driving them back, giving the rebel army a much-needed chance to regroup, resupply, and develop a new strategy. Now, although it was a victory for the rebels that day, the war continued for many years. There were victories and defeats, and eventually they prevailed, thanks in no small part to their leader who led them till the end. What does that sound like to you? Yeah, Star Wars. What if I told you it was this guy? That's right. That's right. George Washington did all those things. I mean, Washington was considered to be one of the best horsemen of his day. At 6'2", he was exceptionally tall from his time, and he'd be tall today. He's taller than me. The battle that I'm talking about, Washington led the Continental Army across the ice-choked Delaware River in the middle of the night, in the middle of a blizzard, to attack the British at Trenton. And of course, he led the Continental Army until the end of the Revolution, orchestrating the final victory at Yorktown. Now, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Washington wasn't doing all these things to become a historic figure. He was doing them in his own place, in his own time. We think of him as the father of our country, who did all these great historic things, but he was really just working to change his own present. And in doing so, he helped create our present. He helped change the future. So what does that mean for you guys? What does that mean for you, a bunch of middle school students sitting in an auditorium in 2018? Right now, history is changing the world. And right now, you're making history. How do I know this? How did I come to believe an idea that seems so contradictory? And how did I get to be so crazy about history? I'm going to let you in a little secret. I became a historian almost by accident. But over time, I began to see these moments in my life pop up that made me realize that history is happening all around us all the time, and I was part of it. I'll give you an example. Who knows what happened on September 11, 2001? Yeah. So like millions of people all around the world, I watched what happened on that day unfold on television. But about 2 weeks later, I was on an Air Force cargo plane with no idea where I was going. We landed at a small airport, and I went right to work. And I spent the next couple of months planning and flying the missions in the earliest part of the US war in Afghanistan. And eventually I went home, went about my life. And a few years later, I was standing in Target. And I was standing in the book section. I picked up a book about the war in Afghanistan, and I flipped it open, and I saw it right there in the table of contents. Stuff that I had seen and done, and it was just part of my job at the time. It didn't seem like making history, but there it was, written down in a history book, preserved forever for everybody to see. My name wasn't mentioned, but sure enough, I made history. I certainly didn't mean to. And this isn't the only time it's happened. It's happened a few other times since then. I think the movie Forrest Gump is onto something. Everybody has these moments in their life that just seem like life to them, but when you look back, they add up to much bigger things, important things, things people write history books about. So with that in mind, I challenge you guys to maximize your historic impact. I mean, somebody in here might go on to be president or cure cancer, but most of us are just going to live our lives every day. In either case, you can still maximize your historic impact, whether you're a president or a teacher. I mean, if you're a teacher, the things you teach somebody might help them to go on to be president or cure cancer. Even George Washington had a teacher, right? So everything you do every day can have historic impact, from the things you say, the causes you support, the stuff you post on social media. So maximize that. Make the best of it. So how do you do that? How do you, as a middle school student, maximize your historic impact? Well, to start with, you got to learn some stuff about history. And I'm not talking about the boring lists of dates and names, but the deep down parts of history that make it matter, that make it interesting. Like the way I told you the story about George Washington. And recognize that that truly is history. Stop thinking about George Washington as this old man in this old painting, this stylized but incomplete version. Stop thinking about history as this list of dates and events that are long gone and don't matter anymore. Start thinking about history as something that's ongoing right now, and it's dynamic, and you're creating it. And in doing that, you're creating the future. And it's going to determine the future of our world. So learn the history of where you live and how it came to be. Learn about other places and people and cultures. Because learning the history of somebody and the history of where they're from puts it in perspective. It makes you realize that they're not doing things to become historic figures. They're doing things in their own time, in their own present. Just like I told you the story about me, it's history to you, but it's deeply a part of my life, and it shaped me, and now you know something about me. And this perspective better enables you to work towards a common goal together. Because knowing history gives you this perspective. You can take all these moments from the past, the successes of failures of people that came before you, and you can build them into something bigger. And then even the bigger questions of technology and immigration, geopolitics can be understood by learning history this way. And then boom, you're maximizing your historic impact. And so knowing that history isn't just some old guy in an old painting, but a rebel leader intent on changing his future by changing his present, helps us maximize our historic impact. So who wants to go out and make some history with me? Yeah. Thank you.